So this is the second. Thanks, Kelly. This is the second session in a series of sessions that we are running through the month of August. They're intended to orient the community and the Rules Advisory Committee on the groundwater management tools that the Oregon Water Resources Department has to address groundwater level declines. These sessions are meant to build a foundational understanding so that we can enter into Rules Advisory Committee meetings feeling better informed and prepared. These sessions will be recorded and made available on our Division 512 webpage within a few days of each session. So if you can't make it, we know it's the busy season. There's not a worry there because we will be recording and making these available to you and the community. I want to mention that this is not an official RAC meeting. So if we start entering into a conversation that is really meant for the larger Rules Advisory Committee, I will ask that we put a pin in the conversation and we carry it over to our next RAC meeting. The next RAC meeting will be August 29th. So just as a heads up there, just a quick ground rule, we're going to let presenters give their presentation and then we'll go into Q&A. During the Q&A, I'll ask that you use the hand raising function and I will do my best to call on folks in the order that it's presented. We will also keep an eye on the chat in case your audio isn't working. And with that, I'm going to go and turn it over to our presenters.
Hi everyone. My name is Kelly Mines. I am the policy analyst / rule writer / coordinator for the department. And then I'll pass it on to my other presenter to introduce himself.
Do you mean me, Kelly?
Yep. I didn't want to say your name, give way.
Hi, everybody. I think I know most of you, and those that I don't, it's good to see you and meet you. My name is Dwight French. I'm the Water Rights Services Division Manager at the department, and pleased to be here today.
Okay, thanks, Dwight, for being here. All right, so as Alexander today, it's said today is our second informational session in a series of 5 informational sessions, and we are going to be talking specifically about the classification tool. But before we do that, I want to give some context to this conversation about what regulatory groundwater control tools that the department has available to them. So we're going to start with this top one on top of this table, this withdrawal of unappropriate waters. What this means is, what unappropriate waters means is basically water that has not been allocated to anyone. And what this tool allows the department to do is to withdraw any unallocated water for any future use. And the intent of this tool is to control future groundwater use. Note that this is out of scope of the rulemaking for 512. We will not be using this tool. The next tool is the one we are talking about today specifically, is the classification of waters. And so what this allows the department to do is to classify the use of water in an area and the quantity of use within an area. So an example of that, and we'll talk about this later, more about the example later, would be in Harney County in 2016. We classified the Greater Harney Valley groundwater area of concern, the GIVGAC, and within that area, we classified only for exempt uses only, and did not allow any more groundwater applications. And so this tool is used for curtailing future groundwater use. It does not curtail any current groundwater use. So our next tool, this one right here, the Serious Water Management Problem Area. This isn't really a regulatory tool itself, but what it is it requires reporting and measurement and reporting of water use within an area. So we will be, it allows us to measure present and future groundwater use. And then the other tool, so these last two, the classification and the Serious Water Management Problem Area tools, we talked to the RAC about it. This is going to be included within the 512 rulemaking scope. The third one that we have available to us is the critical groundwater area designation. This is our Division 10 rules, and kind of the overview of that, I would say, is that it's a tool that we use to designate a basin within Oregon, a critical groundwater area, which allows us then, after designation, via rule writing and rule adoption, allows us to control present groundwater use. And so I'm purposely kind of going just about at the surface of these tools right now to provide context, but these informational sessions will be going more in depth. Like next week, we'll be talking about the serious water management problem areas. And then week 4, we'll be talking about voluntary. And week 5, we'll be talking about the groundwater area designations. Okay, and this last tool down here, this groundwater mitigation area, this is specifically for groundwater allocation into the Deschutes Basin. So we will not be using that tool for 512. One last regulatory tool that we have is just regulating on permit conditions. So each permit has an allotment allowed, and we can regulate to that use. One other tool that we have that is not regulatory, but is more voluntary, which is the voluntary agreements. So that's an agreement between groundwater users within the same groundwater system. We'll be talking about that in informational session 4. Okay. So also just to provide more context, why are we talking about these groundwater tools? Well, we kicked off the rulemaking process for the Harney County Division 512 rules. Last April, we had our first RAC. And our second RAC is coming August 29th. So what a RAC is, or a Rules Advisory Committee, is a group of people, people, affected parties that are likely going to be affected by the adoption of these rules. We use those members of the Rules Advisory Committee, or RAC, to kind of discuss the draft rule language and the physical impact of the rules, and they kind of help us. They help us but they help us draft these rules in a way that is going to be both serving towards the department and also towards the community. After that, from February 2024 to June 2024, we'll be doing a public notification of the rules, holding public hearings there in Harney County. And then once we finish up the public notification, July 2024, we'll write our report to the Water Resources Commission, and hopefully in September there, we'll get these rules adopted. So this is the projected timeline. It can change. For example, we could decide that we need more RACs after our last one in January 2024. But right now, that's what we are looking for, the rulemaking process. But enough of this background and context. Let's get into classification. And that's what we're here to talk about today. So RS 536.340 authorizes the commission to classify water within a basin as to the highest and best use and quantity of use. i.e., it allows us to classify an area and say that the water could only be used for this specific type and could be used for this much, right? So going back to that example of the Greater Harney Valley Groundwater Area of Concern, the GIVGAC, right? We classified it for exempt uses only. We specified the type and the quantities allowed. It affects future use only and does not affect current use or users. And again, just a good example of that is the GIVGAC established in 2016. There are many different reasons and justifications for classification and why the department does it. Particularly for groundwater, some reasons that we could use for justification would be that the groundwater levels in the area are declining. And we can know this by either observing in our well network. We can be getting dry well reports in the area, or we can also be just getting locally reported conditions. Another reason that we could classify an area that we could see that the groundwater area in the area is shown to be over allocated, allocating meaning that we overpromised what the resource can deliver. So this is not an exhaustive list of justifications for classification, but these are some reasons why we would choose to classify a basin in the state. And so before we go to the RAC, there are some decisions points that OWRD needs to make on classification that are kind of required by statute. So the first decision point would be the boundary of the classification area, right? So how are we going to, the GIVGAC was drawn in 2016. And so how are we decide how are we going to draw that boundary? Is it going to be administratively? So example of that, it could be this road from this road to that road could be like an example of administrative basin, right? You have geological boundaries. It could be from, I don't know, I can't give an example of that. And it can also be from hydrological boundaries, right? So we make a decision of what the boundary is of the classification. And then the next decision point we have to make is what type of use and the quantity use are we allowing within the designation of that classification, right? Is it exempt use only? Are we going to be using, are we going to be having sidebars and allowing like limited license for short-term uses? Those are the kind of decisions that we make internally, and then we bring to the RAC and have that conversation with them on, okay, this is what we think we want to classify. Are there any criteria that you want to add to the classification, or any kind of different types of water that you want to add? So we have that conversation. So again, we internally decide the boundary, and we also decide the types of use and the quantity of use. We bring it to the RAC and we have that conversation. Okay, so we're going to kind of get into an example of the classification, and I'm actually going to pass it over to Dwight, where he helped with the GIVGAC in 2016. Go ahead, Dwight.
All right, thanks, Gilly.
Mhm.
So, yeah, when in 2015, when the department decided that we needed to begin a rulemaking to limit future permitting opportunities in this section of Harney County, which we ended up naming the Greater Harney Valley Groundwater Area of Concern, or GIVGAC. So we started that effort with some rules advisory committee meetings in 2015. Some of you might remember there was we got interrupted because of a standoff at the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge, and we ended up taking a couple-month break, but we got back together. We ended up getting the rules passed on April 15th, 2016. And then they went into effect, I think, just a few days later. And just to reemphasize a couple of points that Kelly mentioned, it's for this tool is for affects future uses of groundwater, the classification tool, and I think a lot of times we end up thinking in terms of classification as what uses are allowed, kind of a fancy synonym for what uses are allowed, what uses are classified. It's just the term classification and classified uses is the way that the statute refers to it. So that's why we end up using that word a lot, but it's what uses are going to be allowed in the future. And when the rules go into effect, it affects applications received on or after that date. What it doesn't do, it doesn't restrict which uses or which applications will be received by the department, but it does limit which uses could be approved by the department. Only areas that are withdrawn from future appropriations under ORS Chapter 538 would be uses that can be turned away at our front counter. In other words, we will not receipt or receive an application for processing if it's been withdrawn from future appropriation by the legislature. And so applications get received and get processed, but one of the 4 major criteria for permitting is this question: is the use a classified use? And if it is does the classification limit that use? Sometimes by with quantities of water, or it may say, yeah, you can, this use is classified, but if you issue any permits in this area for that use, it's got to be conditioned a certain way. And we've got a few examples of that. So classification is a really powerful tool. One of the reasons that I like it to be used in areas like the GIVGAC, where you've got some concerns about water quantity and how much water is left, is that our public has an opportunity to understand that before they file an application. You know, it's a published rule. It's available on their internet. You can find it through our website or the Secretary of State's website. You can, if many applicants will go to their water master and say, hey, I'm thinking about, you know, I want to grow crops on my field, and the water master can then look up with that applicant in the basin program and find out what uses are classified for that particular area. And so if a use is not classified or not allowed, then the applicant is probably not going to file an application. So that's important to me as the administrator for the Water Rights Services Division, because as soon as someone goes to all that effort to create an application for a water use and mails in that application with all the work that goes into it and the fees to pay for the department to process it, they are invested in that outcome. They file that application because they want a permit. And if they can find out ahead of time that it's going to be a big challenge and they're probably not going to get a permit, then they're probably not going to file. And that saves them a lot of time and money, and the department a lot of time and money as well. So let's see, I'm getting a call on my work phone. I'm just going to say I can't talk right now. Okay. So let's see. If you move ahead, Kelly, I know I've got a couple other points to make, but I forget what all the slides were. Okay. So back to the GIVGAC example. Boundaries were mostly geographical boundaries. And there was an area where we had some discussion where it was outside the geographical boundary, but the groundwater reviews were showing that it was the exact same treatment as those applications that were within the boundary. So in one area, kind of down in the southeast area, there's a square little area that juts out to the right. And we decided to add that area into the GIVGAC because it looked to us like applications there were going to be treated the same as applications that were inside the geographic boundary. And so anyway, we made that adjustment. And inside the GIVGAC, it allows for exempt uses only. Now, go ahead, Kelly, with the next slide. Okay. And then we've got a listing here of what the groundwater exempt uses are. Many of you are used to seeing this. I won't go over them in detail, but if your groundwater use is exempt, then you don't need a permit, registration, or certificate to use water for those uses. And they include stock watering, watering of any lawn or non-commercial garden not exceeding a half acre in area, single or group domestic purposes not exceeding 15,000 gallons a day, which is really a lot of water. I've seen 30 homes all hooked up together that qualify under that particular limitation, although they would also have to share a half an acre in area of non-commercial garden. Downhole heat exchanges is another one. And then any single industrial or commercial purpose in an amount not exceeding 5,000 gallons a day, that's another one. So we see a few of those, but we see a lot of the stock watering, domestic use, and up to half an acre of non-commercial lawn and garden. Those are kind of the popular ones. Next slide, Kelly. Okay. So yeah, this is my, I wanted a reminder about limited license, but I knew there was a slide on that. So are there types of uses within the groundwater area that should be allowed? Limited licenses is an important conversation that I think needs to be had, not necessarily today, but for the GIVGAC. I mean, for the Rules Advisory Committee. But just to let you, I just want to give you a little context about limited licenses and how classification can be a tool to shape limited license issuance inside an area like the GIVGAC. With a classification, you can limit limited license issuance in the future. It's only done, I believe there's one little area inside the Willamette Basin where reference is made to limited license. But our statutes and rules tell us that if limited license is specifically restricted in a basin program, then you follow that restriction. And there's only one spot where this tool has been used, and that's in the Willamette. So it could be discussed as a tool to restrict future limited license issuance in the GIVGAC. And it could be the types of uses or the period of uses for a limited license. In the statute, the limited licenses are for short-term uses, and the statute goes on to say up to a period not to exceed 5 years per limited license application. So the statute kind of conflates short-term uses and up to 5 years together. So one thing that the RAC could consider is, well, maybe limited licenses in the GIVGAC should only be issued for 1 year. and not 5 years. 5 years is a fairly long time for an area where we have groundwater concerns. Another, it could also limit, you could say, okay, only limited licenses for these particular uses, but for a small quantity. Maybe a small quantity in terms of gallons per minute, cubic feet per second, acre feet per day, total acre feet for the limited license period, however you wanted to do that. One important consideration for limited license, where I think it is a really good use, are roadway construction projects where a small amount of water is needed for cleaning equipment, helping to cure concrete, maybe if you're rebuilding a bridge. In some of those places, to get water out, 50 miles down the road to a bridge construction where you don't need much water, but you are going to need a little bit of clean water. That's a public use. There's a public benefit for that. That's, something to think about. Water projects that benefit the basin. That's a good example, Kelly, because it's a tricky one. Lots of people want to argue that my project will benefit the basin, and they can give you 100 reasons, if you want to listen to them all, about why this would benefit their particular, why it would benefit the basin. Small community water systems. Well, remember, there is an exempt use for group domestic up to 15,000 gallons a day. So if you needed something bigger than 15,000 gallons a day for a domestic use, a group domestic use, then you would want to make use for that by saying, by allowing a limited license classification that did that. If the RAC wants to get into using classification on limited licenses. And we also get limited license requests to irrigate projects. Maybe it's a bank stabilization, because generally limited licenses are not allowed for irrigation unless it's from stored water, or to irrigate a crop that's not going to require irrigation in the future, or for projects like erosion control, where you just you get some plants going near the bank. If you've had some kind of bank restructuring work and you got to replant that area and water it, it's not going to require water for the long term, but for a short term, just to get those plants there so that they'll hold the bank up after the floodwaters, come in the spring. Okay, I think I've covered everything I wanted to cover, but why don't you move on to the next slide or remind me if there's anything else.
No, so this slide is just the questions we got from the RAC
Okay.
one. So that the first question would be, does classification restrict you from transferring a water right? No, the transfer process does not consider basin classification. The next question, how will classification affect new businesses? So a business could plug into an existing municipal water right, but classification restricts any new groundwater use. And then can classification be rolled back? Okay, there is a possibility of rolling back a classification if there is a strong evidence to do so. So those answers were from Ivan during RAC 1. I kind of just want to remind you all of just the answers. So from here on, that's our presentation. So we're going to start taking questions and answers. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I could see those who's asking. But
And it looks like Ken posed 2 questions
yeah,
in the chat for us.
And for some reason, I don't see those. I wonder if I'm not,
They
I
should be in
don't,
the chat box. So if you look in the lower portion of your screen, there's a
okay,
black
I see 'em.
bar,
Okay,
and then you can click chat and it'll pop up in that right-hand corner of your screen.
okay.
And for folks not able to look at the chat or might be multitasking, I'll just read Ken's questions so that they're documented. Since the 512 rules are being updated, I presume that the give-gag will remain in place. Will there be a conversation about the boundary and uses and conditions other than exempt uses? So that's question number 1. And Kelly, do you want to
yeah.
tackle
So
that one?
we're certainly open, Ken, to having conversations about other uses rather than exempt use. Yeah. So we're willing to have that conversation. In fact, the point of one of those slides that Dwight was saying about, like, okay, what are examples of other allowable uses for classification? I was trying to get the RAC members to start thinking about, okay, what other uses that we should maybe consider allowing within the classification boundary. So yes, certainly we are open to having that conversation.
And to answer the second part of that question about the boundary, we'll be talking about boundaries in our subsequent RAC meetings, official RAC meetings. So August 29th, as well as the October meeting. So that gets at that other piece, Ken, that you were asking about. And then Ken's second question was, it seems that allowing limited licenses for the purposes of the Harney Valley Groundwater CREP program, they should be made available for up to 3 years. So that's something we can note and carry over when we start having those conversations about uses. We can make a note that you've made that recommendation, Ken, and we have discussed limited licenses in relation to the CREP program. And we do have Graham Thomas tuning into the Rules Advisory Committee process, and he is our CREP program manager. So we'll make sure that we are getting his input as well. And Jason Spreet, who is the East Region manager. Does anyone else? Looks like John, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I haven't found the hand up button on the computer yet.
It's all right. I like the physical hand raise too.
Great. Dwight, good to see you again. A question, Dwight, maybe I misunderstood on the limited licenses. I've run into those not being approved or allowed in both the Give-Gag and Christmas Valley when I've applied for those for solar farms, as an example. Did you say that limited licenses are okay if they're not specifically denied,
Okay.
or what's the scoop?
Okay, so for a limited license application, we primarily look at water availability and injury. But the statute also tells us to look at any, or excuse me, it's either the statute or the rules tell us to also consider classifications. And because classification is specifically used in the Willamette Basin, then we know that the commission can and has used classification in basin programs to specifically limit where limited licenses can be issued. So it's not the only criteria, but it's one criteria that's only been used one time.
Okay.
And that's in the Willamette. So if you know someone whose applications were limited or denied outside the Willamette, and it sounds like you do, then that it must have been limited for reasons other than classification.
I would have to look back at the written denials. It seemed like I was told that no more groundwater was available, and so they wouldn't be considered, but I'd have to look
Right.
back.
Right. You said right there, some key words. If groundwater is not available, because all limited licenses that propose to use water from a well or groundwater are going to be reviewed by our groundwater section. And if the review comes back and says there's no groundwater available, then we will not issue it.
Okay.
So if there, in addition to that, if there were to be a classification that said no new uses or no limited license issuance in this area except for these uses, then we would look at that also, even if groundwater was available. So there can be, multiple layers or lenses that we'll look through to see if a limited license or an application for a permanent use can be approved.
One way, obviously, we handle it in the Deschutes Basin with people providing mitigation or offset. And that is also not necessarily formal mitigation, but it's usually relatively easy to find someone that'll not irrigate for the length of the limited license or a year or two as offset for that limited license. Is that didn't help when I was trying to go through with those, but is that another option if our, obviously it's not within the capacity of the resource. I mean, we're, is that an option for the GIVGAC?
Well, I think, John, that's an excellent question for the GIVGAC RAC to consider. And when you say, if you use the classification tool can be a fairly blunt instrument. If you say, it can't be used for, or it can only be used in this circumstance, then that's it.
Yeah.
But if you say, well, it can't be used for anything except these couple of uses that are classified, unless you temporarily offset that use with an equal amount of acre feet in the same growing season. And I'm not maybe explaining myself really clearly, but you could then you can create some exceptions, not exemptions, but exceptions to the otherwise blunt instrument.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
And did that answer your question for the most part, John?
Yes, it's something I'd like to see in the rules.
Okay, thank you so much. Ken dropped another question in the chat, and it says, ORS 536.341B requires the department to enforce laws concerning cancellation, release, and discharge of excessive unused claims to waters of the state. Has the department done so in the GIVGAC?
I think we should look to, not to put, is Dally here? So that's the classification statute that he is citing. So that's section 1B. But I'm not entirely sure if we have. Dally, do you have some context on has that happened in the GIFGAC if you're here?
Don't put it on Get Dally. He
All right.
just got here.
Oh, okay. Okay.
I don't, can you say the question again?
Yes. Go ahead, Alexandra. Yeah.
So ORS 536-341B requires the department to enforce laws concerning cancellation, release, and discharge of excessive unused claims to waters of the state. Has the department done so in the GIVGAC? And that question came from Ken Beerley.
Right. I'm not aware of any that I haven't done anything to that. You know, I'm not sure what groundwater has, if they've done something for that, but I have not, that I know would fall into that classification anyway.
Okay.
I know that John Sanfilippo has done some inspections, but there is a sense that there are a number of abandoned wells, which would fall under, at least in my opinion, would fall under this statutory requirement. And so, and there's a concern in the community that there's a lot of water use that's not, or there is water use that isn't subject or isn't being authorized legitimately. So there's a question there about how rigorous the department has been in ensuring that the water use complies with current permitting. So
we have shut down some things, Ken, you know, that we found that were illegal water use, and we will continue to do so. But, you know, in this GIVGAC even, it's a huge area where, you know, I can't see. So I need, you know, members of the public to come and give me, you know, a complaint, and then I can investigate that, because I just don't have the time or resources to cover this whole GIVGAC to see that everything is permitted and what's being used and right or wrong.
that seems like a very appropriate response, but the issue is that there is a statutory requirement for the department. And I think consideration of that is important.
I agree.
Thanks, Ken. Do any other folks have questions online around kind of what is this tool of classification? How has it been used? Quiet group today. That's all right. That means that hopefully that means we did a good job in explaining what the tool is and how we've used it, if we don't have many questions coming from the group. Well, if any questions come up between now and the next Rules Advisory Committee meeting, you are welcome to submit them to Kelly, and he can work with other department staff to get those questions answered for you, because we want to kind of keep this as an iterative process. So if questions come up between now and a session, we want to make sure that we're making that information available to folks along the way as well. Just because it doesn't come to you today doesn't mean you can't submit questions to us and we can answer those later on down the road. We want you to go into that August 29th RAC meeting feeling prepared. One other note on classification is that we will be having a public meeting in Seneca at the Seneca Elementary School on, Kelly, correct me if I'm wrong, August 19th.
Yes.
Okay, August 19th from 5:30 to 7:30. And we'll be going over this tool again with members of the broader community over there. We've presented before about these groundwater tools in Harney County. We also want to make sure that we're doing some outreach to folks in Grant County. So we've notified members of the public and sent out press releases, but we,
Correction, it's August 16th.
August
Well,
16th.
August
Okay,
16th, yes. Mhm.
lots of meetings. So
Lots of
thank you
meetings,
for that,
yes. Mhm.
Kelly.
Mhm.
So we'll be covering this classification tool again over there. So if you missed it or your neighbors missed this meeting today, they can also attend that meeting in Seneca to ask questions and learn more about the tool as well at that meeting. So not the only opportunity to ask questions from the department on classification as a groundwater management tool. And Ken asked, what is the status of the section 10 rules?
So the Division 10 rules are going to be adopted September 28th or 29th in Harney. So we're bringing it to the Water Resources Commission and they hopefully will be adopted. I have confidence that they will be adopted. So
And Kelly, for folks that might be watching this online that are not
Mhm.
familiar with the Division 10 rules, can you just quickly give an explanation of what those rules are?
no, I don't know if there's such thing as a quick explanation for Division 10, but I'll give it a shot. Yeah, so the Division 10 rules are the rules that so the Division 10 rules are the critical groundwater area designation rules. And so what that means is it's a set of rules that allows us to look at a basin that's meeting certain statutory criteria. So one of those conditions is that there's a pattern of substantial interference between wells. If one of those conditions are met, so for example, the pattern, then the department can initiate the designation process, which requires a robust, I said that right, rule writing process. And once the rule writing process is over, and the rules are adopted, the area is then designated a critical groundwater area. And from there, the department can initiate groundwater control measures. So that's kind of in a nutshell, Division 10. There's a lot more to unpack there, but that's my brief summary.
And we'll be covering the Division 10 rules specifically at our last session of this series. So
Yeah.
anyone interested in learning more, but I appreciate you asking Ken about the progress of those rules as they're very closely interrelated to the Division 512 rules. And we will be bringing the Oregon Water Resources Commission and having a meeting in the community of Burns, September 28th and 29th. And we'll be bringing those rules to our commission at that time. So very relevant. And I appreciate you asking the question, Ken. Any other questions from the group around classification? And if not, that's okay. We can always, folks from the Oregon Water Resources Department will stay online for the next 9 minutes. And we can answer questions up until that point, but folks are welcome to take 9 minutes of their afternoon back if you don't want to stick around and ask questions. And I appreciate everyone for taking the time to attend today. Again, we really just want to help folks wrap their minds around these complex groundwater management tools so that we can enter these rulemaking conversations with a mutual understanding of what this means and how it can be applied in the Harney Basin. So I appreciate folks for taking the time to learn with us today and asking questions and being curious. And again, you're welcome to follow up with Kelly or myself after this Rules Advisory Committee meeting if questions spur around this topic.
You mean informational session meeting?
Informational session
Yes.
meeting.
Mhm.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Do you want to stop the recording, Kelly?
Yes.